Thank you.
Thank you very much for watching. We are live in Canberra. Now, a couple of people have already hit me up on Twitter suggesting that either I'm drunk or particularly angry. I don't know why. Maybe it's just the lighting. I'm not feeling any different. Janine Perrott knows me best, though, my colleague at Sky News, and she can evaluate whether I'm either drunk or angry. How are you, my dear?
I think you're exactly as we always see you, Paul. I don't notice any great change, personally.
That's actually not an endorsement.
Yeah, that worries me a lot. All right, Ross Cameron is sitting here by her side as well. How are you, Ross?
Very well indeed.
All right, and two parliamentary representatives to give this Canberra flavour. Fiona Scott from the seat of Lindsay, the Liberal MP, and the acceptable face of the Labor Party, as I like to say. Hello, Ed.
It's great to be on the UFC equivalent. It airs here on Sky News.
Now, can I say this, though, is that in Canberra, if you do get the chance to come down, you've got to go to the National Library and you've got to check out the Mapping the World exhibition. It is phenomenal. Have either of you, checked it out?
Not this time.
Oh, come on, you've got to go do it. It's magnificent. It's literally old stuff, you know, sort of turn of many a century. It's really cool. Some Matthew Flinders stuff. It's worth having a look at.
That'd be amazing.
Let us not bore people with artistic reviews. Qantas, should they change the rules? Will they change the rules? Interesting to note here that it did seem that the government was starting to suggest this is where it is going to go, but question time things started to roll back a little. Janine, I've always believed that Qantas should play by the same rules that Virgin does, because that's the market, and that means if foreign investment is the way they can ramp up their money, good and fair enough. But what do you think about the government floating and removing all in the same day?
Well, you know, you and I disagree on this. I believe Qantas is a special case, that industry assistance should be looked at. You know, each case should go on its own merit. I genuinely believe Qantas as a national carrier should be considered different. Look, it's a moot point changing the Foreign Ownership Act, because it's not going to get through the Senate. I also don't think we're going to have a rush of foreign airlines or foreign investors. There might be some opportunists. That's not necessarily good for us. I don't see how we're protecting it. But as I say, it's a moot point. The debt guarantee is another issue. Sure, Virgin's going to scream, there'll be issues. At this moment, we did it for our banks. I kind of think, so long as we're not putting money in. My key point, though, at the moment is a lot of rhetoric from the government that Qantas has to get its house in order. Absolutely. But does that only mean the workers, the union practices, entitlements? Because I would argue they're in this position because of a very bad CEO, a bad strategy that hasn't worked, and to get to this point means a clean out at the top.
But also, Ed, I'm sorry, I think that Australia has to some degree, grow up about the idea about Qantas as the national carrier. Yes, Qantas does service more locations than Virgin. However, in the idea of, in the middle of an emergency, Virgin have said that they're more than willing to send the planes that need to be sent, and Qantas don't do it out of the goodness of their own heart. They send a bloody bill back to the taxpayer. What do you think has to happen with Qantas?
Well, I take this view. I want to see, and I certainly think we should see, a lot of strong Australian companies, both strong here and being able to compete overseas. But if we want our companies to actually make money overseas, you need to also open the doors here. So I'm not one that argues against foreign investment because it's got a place and a part to play, particularly in an economy like ours. But with Qantas, the concern is, particularly in terms of losing the headquarters, if you have a foreign investor that moves the headquarters of Qantas, but the big thing is what happens to jobs, and so that is an issue. But some of the points you raise, I mean, consumers too, they feel very strongly about a national carrier, but they get onto Webjet and they shop around, and I think one of the big things that's sort of kept people, loyal to Qantas is also another thing is a very strong frequent flyer program.
Well, exactly, that all of you pollies love. Any of the chairman's lounge and all of this business, you'd both be in there, wouldn't you?
Does this say kick here?
Yeah, no, I'm just saying.
It doesn't.
You're not a chairman's lounge man?
Well, no, they do provide. I'm not going to lie. They do provide me, and I'm waiting for them to take it off me on so many times after I criticise.
Fiona, the chairman's lounge?
I haven't actually used the Chairman's Lounge because I always drive to Canberra. So
Right, but you can if you want to?
I can if I want to, but I haven't actually used it.
All right, what do you think the government has to do here? I mean, we'll get into what Warren Truss had to say in a second here, but ultimately, how do we help Qantas, save Qantas, free Qantas?
I mean, look, I quite simply, the carbon tax has added $106 million annually to Qantas, and that's quite an impost on the business. But I do agree with Janine in regard to they do need to look after their own backyard. And coming to the government as being the ATM of last resort, I'm not totally convinced that that's the best way to go either.
All right, well, here's part of what Warren Truss had to say a little earlier in the day. Have a look.
Now, we have indicated an interest in being prepared to seek to legislate, to take away the legislative and government-imposed disadvantages that Qantas faces on the domestic market. And as has already been reported, we're working on legislation to achieve that.
And Ross Cameron, before I get you to get the final say on all of this, I wanted to show the exchange between Bill Shorten and the Prime Minister in Parliament today. There is part of the question, and the way that the question is asked, is the question I want to start to raise with you in a second, Ross Cameron. So pay attention to what Bill Shorten had to say today in Parliament.
Questions to the Prime Minister. The government has today announced that it will lift ownership restrictions on Australia's national carrier Qantas. How will selling the nation's airline stop Australian jobs from going overseas? And what is the government's plan for jobs at Qantas?
I've got to say to members opposite, if they are fair income about wanting Qantas to flourish, one thing they can do, scrap the carbon tax. Scrap the carbon tax. $106 million. $106 million a year.
Fiona's going to get a gold star for backing up the Prime Minister. Now, Ross, the question though. Janine mentioned national carrier, Ed mentioned national carrier, but the way that the Leader of the Opposition asked the question today was about selling off the airline to foreigners. This made it seem like the government still owned the damn airline. It doesn't own the airline. Is there any defence for not letting the market rule over Qantas?
Well, I feel for the directors of Qantas because it is a beast which is it's neither one thing nor the other. It's neither private nor public. It's run by the board, the executive, but 15 trade unions. It's got the Parliament in the back seat telling it whether or not how it can raise capital, where it can do maintenance. Qantas is in a situation where it's got 140 aircraft, many of them too small, lots of different classes, hard to maintain, flying too frequently, too often empty. It needs a smaller fleet of larger aircraft flying less frequently with more passengers in each plane. But the cost of each aircraft, one A380 costs $400 million. When Qantas buys 2 planes, you can actually see it in the national accounts on a month-on-month basis. But its competition, for example, just one budget airline in Asia has just ordered 40 A380s. That's $16 billion in capital. Emirates has on order 140 A380s. That's over $50 billion in capital. So it is very easy to lose very large sums of money in an industry which is totally exposed to the global fuel price, which is heavily unionised and which has got no shelter. There's no industry which is more global than aviation. So if we want this, if we're concerned about Australian jobs, we protect jobs on the backswing of productive and profitable enterprises. And the only way for this enterprise to be profitable is for the directors to be able to take real risks and to raise capital to equip the enterprise with the aircraft that it needs.
I would have thought their entire loss-making Asian strategy was a risk they took that didn't work. Don't they have to be held accountable for their strategies?
Well, I think if they come to government asking for special help and handouts,
I think the government should
say
it
does reflect on their strategy. To be fair to the management, I mean, Qantas was originally a government-owned enterprise. It still behaves in many ways because, in part, of this legislation as a government-owned enterprise. And as we know, the relationship between a government-owned enterprise and the trade union movement is the same as the relationship between a sick sperm whale and a fleet of hammerhead sharks.
Nice analogy.
So, let's give these guys a chance before they get destroyed by, by the trade union movement.
All right,
let's break.
All right, well, what do you think? Respond to that one.
I mean,
and then I want to move on to something else.
I mean, it's Ross will talk through the evidence and the logic, and you go, yep, and then he just puts that ideological cherry at the end of at the end of it all. I mean, this is as even acknowledged, a very competitive market, and it's fighting on a whole number of fronts in terms of fuel costs or aviation, in terms of the dollar, and competition, as was outlined earlier.
And the carbon tax you guys added.
And well, apparently that's to blame for everything, including the bogeyman under my bed. But
nice to see you acknowledge it.
No, I just figure if you guys are living that fantasy, why get in the way of that?
Very well put.
But there are, you know, challenges there, and certainly accepted. But I think there is something iconic. I mean, Bill wasn't talking today, if I can respond to a point you made. He wasn't making out that this was a government-owned entity. Everyone knows it ain't. But it does occupy a very special place in Australia as a sort of iconic company.
But the reason that it occupies that space is because of its history, but it's also because of the bloody ads that they make. Yeah. It's because of how super Aussie and we're more Australian than anything else, and we own Ayers Rock, and we own Uluru and the Sunset. I mean, that's the brand that they've tried to put out there, which is great, but it doesn't mean I've got to pay for anything else when we've got a joint that's had to borrow $500 million to keep the bloody door open. Well, it's my thoughts anyway. All right, now I quickly want to turn to what Stephen Conroy did today in Senate estimates. I thought this was flat out disgraceful for two reasons. One, this bloke knows the game, so he's not new to it. But secondly, this is the bloke who's the shadow defence minister. And we all know you can beat the living tripe out of the politicians, but you don't have a go at either the public servants who are following on their orders, and most certainly not the bloody army. Here's part of what I think is a shameful moment for Stephen Conroy. Have a look.
You can't tell us the truth. You can't tell the Australian public the truth because you might upset an international neighbour.
Senator, I feel
that's called a political cover-up.
Senator, I feel I've explained the basis of
That's a political cover-up.
Decisions.
You're engaged in a political cover-up.
And Senator
Conroy, I resent that. I don't know if the General does. To accuse a serving officer of a political cover-up is something you should apologise for.
I take extreme offence at that statement you've made.
Looks very comfortable in his jumper, doesn't he? Here's what the Defence Minister had to say during a rare moment in front of the cameras.
I, for one, will not, as Defence Minister, tolerate an attack upon the integrity of one of Australia's most respected senior officers. Now, the point about this is it is a cowardly attack. This is not a theatre where you can throw around defaming statements and attack the impunity of good people.
All right, Ed, let's get the awkward bit out of the way. It's indefensible what was said and all of that, but he has turned around and decided to offer some sort of an apology. What next? Has everyone learnt their lesson, or is there need for discipline? How do you think it should play from here?
Well, I'm not going to dance around it. What he said was wrong. Shouldn't have been said. Not to serving officer that way. He was right to withdraw the comments. But I'll also make the point too. I think that I don't think that the defence personnel should be put in that position at any rate in terms of the way that Scott Morrison has got personnel involved in this and having them at the press conferences. He should just front up himself and do it. But I don't want people thinking in any way, shape or form that that's an excuse for what happened today. It ain't. It's wrong. But one thing... he was right to withdraw the comment.
No, absolutely. But one thing that's also important to notice here, though, Fiona, is that when I was watching those estimates today in before and after question time, so you mightn't have seen everything because you were running in and out of the house, but still, the lines seem to be from the bureaucrats and from the military personnel. Oh, that's something for the minister. We can't talk about operational. At what point in time do you have to put a bit more meat on the bone rather than just it's working?
Well, I think the fact that 68 days without a boat arrival is proof in the pudding that it's working. I mean, when these guys got into government in 2007, there were 4 people living in asylum, so living in as refugees in detention. So, I mean, I think they took what was a policy platform that was working and they broke it, and we saw a huge amount of boat people come in. Now we've been able to stop the boats for 68 days, which is important because it means we're not going to be losing all these lives at sea.
But there is this thing though, Ross, where, and we spoke about this last night in relation to Manus Island, where, okay, boats have stopped for 68 days, that is the achievement, that is what people wanted them to do. But there are 2 big things they have to do. They have to clear the backlog of people that are physically in detention in Nauru and Manus Island. And 2, I just think that we have to be careful about this constant dance where nobody tells us what's really going on. They only tell us whether it's working or not. And of course, by the metric of are boats turning up, it is working. What do you think of all of that? And maybe even Stephen Conroy, there's a lot in that.
Yeah, well, if you want to start with Conroy, I think whatever you make of the comments, you've got a bloke who is the shadow minister who's got to work with the Department of Defence for the next 2.5 years And this will be one of the earliest formal conversations he's had with one of the most senior figures in the Defence Forces. And you can imagine the other sort of tens of thousands of Defence personnel looking on and forming a judgment about the new Shadow Minister for Defence. Now, to be fair, Ed Husic has manned up very admirably tonight, and I give full marks to Ed, whose star continues to rise within the ALP.
Bloody oath.
But I think that from a purely strategic standpoint, it's hard for me to see how Senator Conroy has really helped his own cause as the Shadow Minister of a very difficult portfolio, which requires a high level of mutual confidence between the department and the Minister or Shadow Minister. In relation to Manus Island, I mean, we are talking about the death of a 23-year-old man, Razi Barati. This is obviously a serious matter, and it's one in which the Minister has said, rightly, that there needs to be a full inquiry, including of his own conduct. And I think that I'm disinclined to make any strong statements. I see that the actual contractor has made what appeared to me to be a virtual admission of some kind when they said that if any of their personnel were involved in misconduct, they would be held accountable. So it's a very murky picture, and we need the facts to emerge before, I think, taking really strong positions. I am pleased to see Transfield Services, a great Australian company, stepping in to take over, and I think all Australians...
Why wouldn't they? It's only $1 billion and a bit that they get.
Well, that was the second half of my sentence, was going to be $1.2 billion for a short-term contract. It shows you the magnitude and scale of the problem that's been created, and it's not going to be unwound in days or weeks.
Yeah, all right. Well, Nini, last word on all of this here, which is, you know, Stephen Conroy, and look, it's a tough job for Ed to have to sit here and he didn't defend the indefensible, and he deserves points for that, and all the people who'll come after him for telling the truth bug you. But what about this scenario here about the way the government plays things like those estimate hearings? There's no justification for what he did. It's not even frustration, but the way the government does seem to handle this is that, you know, it's, oh, ask the minister, ask the bloke in charge of it. I can't ask you because we've got to wait for the minister to tell you. It's not about not knowing, but there does seem to be the game, which is they've worked out how not to have to tell us how they are stopping the boats.
Oh, Paul, I've been around, watched Senate estimates for many years, and they are always robust and colourful. But Stephen Conroy ain't no Senator John Faulkner. He has no finesse. He's a grubby little bobber boy and head kicker whose only claim to fame is he can count numbers. Given the mess he made of the last government, I'm surprised he's not, you know, on the backbench. That's their fault. The longer he's there, as you say, he's a reminder of all that's ugly and wrong with the former Labor government and this Labor opposition. And all I can say is, you know, testimony to Ed, Stephen Conroy is the unacceptable face of Labor. Ed Husic is the future.
Hear, hear. Sorry, Ed, we're piling it on you, mate. All of this praise, all of this love, it's coming your way.
We're ruining it for you, Ed.
Yeah, I'm sorry, mate.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just seeing a lot of stuff flash before my eyes. Well, can I mean, but on that point, look...
You're not going to claim Kevin Rudd stopped the boats.
Two things, well, I'd like to put the other side of the story on. Two things, I mean, Fiona wasn't here during the last Parliament, but when we had tried to deal with this, you know, in particular in terms of Malaysia, which I know you had disagreements with, but that whole notion of being able to work within the neighbourhood and create the disincentive, we tried to put in place, and Scott Morrison did a deal with the Greens to stop it. And then went and pointed to the fact that there were all these arrivals that were still coming. And the second thing is, yeah, unfortunately, Paul, I am going to say that one of the biggest things that had an impact on arrivals was the agreement that we set up with PNG that was in part criticised at the time by the then opposition. And, you know, frankly, you know, we're supposed to be giving them credit on, in terms of some of the stats that you used earlier, Fiona. Well, you know what I'm going to say? If they're going to claim secrecy, not answer questions, not provide documents, they shouldn't get credit in terms of these numbers, because really you need to have oversight about what is actually being provided to the public in terms of data.
All right, can you know what you think? The hashtag PM Live, email pmlive@skynews.com.au. The arm wrestle will continue here during the break, and we'll be back in a moment as we're live across the country, only on Sky News.